Morning guys, I'm Dave Canterbury with Self-Reliance Outfitters in the Pathfinder School, and what I thought we'd do today is I came out here to a camp location that I use quite often on a ridge that's really good for a base camp for deer hunting and things like that. And what I wanted to do today was discuss ground camping or ground sleeping with you a little bit. Whether you're using a tent like this or whether you're using a tarp, the intent is to sleep on the ground. And when you do that, you have to think about insulation. Insulation is the key element to being able to get a good, comfortable night's sleep on the ground. You also need to think about loft. And loft is going to give you not only insulative value, but it's also going to give you comfort level. And comfort level is very important with ground sleeping because a good night's sleep is something that you can't overstate when it comes to spending multiple nights in the outdoors. Anybody can rough it for a single night, sleep on the ground, whatever the case may be, close to a long fire, and you'll get through it okay. But if you're going to spend more than one day out or you want to be comfortable, you're going to need certain elements within your kit to be able to affect that. And we talked before in videos past about something to sleep on, something to sleep under, and something to sleep inside of. And so a tent, a sleeping pad, and a sleeping bag or over quilt blanket type scenario is what you're going to want. So the key to that is understanding what's going to be the best system for you and how to incorporate that into your current system, and also decide what your budget's going to be for something like that, because there's lots of ways you can go about that. And obviously the more ultralight you get with things, the more expensive they are. But sometimes the more ultralight you get with things, you're also going to make sacrifices in that insulative value as well, especially when you're talking about things like ground pads. Now, there are ground pads out there that have very high R values, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes, that are, you know, mid-range pads. They aren't too god-awful expensive, although they are fairly expensive compared to something you'd buy at a discount store or a chain store, most likely. However, even though they have good insulation value, they're not real comfortable sometimes to sleep on due to loft. And so we're going to discuss that as well. So stay with me. We're going to take some pads out. We're going to talk through different pads, talk about R values, and all those types of things in this video. Hang tight. Okay, we're going to spend a pretty good amount of time in this video discussing different types of ground pad options. And the reason for that is you can use any type of overstructure to sleep under that you want. You can use a tent, you can use a tarp. Those things really don't matter as long as they're blocking wind, so you don't have to worry about convection problems. And they have, the lower that peak is, the more heat it's going to hold in. But that can become a problem with condensation, especially in something like a tent. So a very high peak, like this tent behind me has, this Robin's Cone 4, is going to not trap near as much moisture inside of it as something that's lower, like a small bivvy type style tent, or even a small dome tent would trap, like a one-man tent. Now, ultralight tents that you've seen me use in the past in my Nesmic series, like the Z-Pax Duplex, those tents are made so that any condensation drains off of them and outside the bathtub area of the tent. So those are designed to be a smaller, more ultralight unit that does well even in colder temperatures. The key really to the whole thing with cold temperatures is, other than what you cover up with or what you sleep inside of, is what you sleep on top of. And that's really going to be the bulk of this video. When it comes to sleeping inside of something, we'll cover that really quickly at the beginning here. You can use anything from some type of a jungle blanket like this to a Swagman roll to a large sleeping bag like this Snug Pack. The problem is, the bulkier this becomes, the more troublesome it is to carry over distance unless you have conveyance. Now, you can go with a top quilt type scenario like the Hammock Gear Burrow that you've seen me use in videos past, and that is a down over quilt. And they found out a long time ago that having a sleeping bag or something that you're going to lay on a portion of the insulation really doesn't do you a lot of favors, because you're crushing that insulation by laying on top of it. So sleeping bags probably are not the best thing if you're looking for a more ultralight, more space saving, and better system for a good night's sleep, you probably just want to go with some type of over quilt that's made from down, or excuse me, has down fill, and it has a foot box in it so you can put your feet inside the foot box, and the rest is just a quilt that goes over top of you. And the hammock gear burrow is great for that. So really there's a mixed bag of what you can carry to sleep inside of, or sleep directly underneath of, inside your tent or tarp. So we won't cover too much about that today, because what I really want to cover is that insulation from the ground. And when you're talking about natural material, and we teach here at the basic class at the Pathfinder School, that if you're going to make a makeshift type mattress out of something like a garbage bag that you're going to fill with debris, like leaves or weeds or something like that, it needs to be 4 inches compressed to give you that insulative value, or that R value that you're going to need to block conduction from the ground. So R value is an important concept to understand when you're looking at ground pads in general. And R value is just a value that's given to something to represent how insulative it is, just like the insulation in your house has an R value. Most ground pads have an R value. So let's talk about something really quick that's very common, like this Z pad from Therm-A-Rest. This is one of the most ultralight things that you can carry. It's not the smallest as far as the footprint in your backpack goes. Most people just strap these to the outside of their backpack. They're fairly large. They take quite a bit of bulk, but they're convenient. You're not going to pop a hole in it, and you can do things like multiple folds and things like that in certain areas if that's what you needed to do, depending on how you want to lay on this ground pad. The problem with something like this is that during the colder months of the year, it's not going to have a very high R value. And I've written down the R values here, the things that we're going to talk about. And the Therm-A-Rest Z pad has a 1.7 R value. So to put that in perspective, when you're talking about R values of sleep pads, anything between 1 and 3 is generally considered a 1 to 3 season option. So you're talking spring, summer, early fall. Anything with a value of 4 to 5 in the R value is going to be considered an all season type pad, depending on where you live. But for something that is extra cold environment, you're going to want something more along the R6 value. So what we want to look at today is we want to look at the different pads, their R values versus how much they weigh and how much bulk they add to our kit, and kind of make intelligent decisions based on that as far as what we want to carry. Now, one of the things that I've found with pads in general is the more loft you have, or the thicker that pad is, whether it's a down-filled pad or whether it's just an air-filled pad, you're going to want loft to provide comfort. If you sleep on your back, you can get away with a little bit thinner pad, but if you're a side sleeper, you're going to want a fairly thick pad. So I've tested lots and lots of pads over the course of the last few years, especially with traveling overseas, sleeping on wood floors, sleeping on the ground and things like that. And the durability of that pad also comes into question when you're talking about sleeping directly on the ground with no type of footprint like a tent floor or some type of Tyvek mat. And you can use a piece of Tyvek on the ground to help alleviate punctures and things like that. It's just something else you have to carry. But if you're carrying a fairly small sheet, it's also very lightweight and doesn't take up much bulk in your pack. And I showed that in the Shadow of Nessmuk series as well. So let's talk about these pads for a minute, and bearing in mind what we spoke to as far as R values go. So this is basically your most inexpensive option, other than making something yourself, like out of Reflectex or something like that. But a purchased pad, you know, something like one of these Therm-A-Rest folding pads or roll-up pads, is probably one of your least expensive options out there, and will do fine for you in the summer months and the late spring and things like that. But they're not real comfortable to sleep on, especially if you are a side sleeper or a stomach sleeper. If you're a back sleeper, they're not horrible bad. So let's talk a little bit about some of these other pads that have a similar R value to the Therm-A-Rest, okay? Because there are several on the market. So remember, again, we'll go back and review. We're talking about an R value on that thing of 1.7, all right? Now, I'm going to go through here. I've got a lot of pads here that I'm going to talk to you about today, but I want to kind of go through them just a little at a time with you so that we get a good view of everything, okay? Now, we're not going to talk too much about hammock sleeping today. Like I said, this is more focused on ground sleeping. However, Clima does have a pad called the Hammock V, and I've used this pad quite a bit. The Hammock V has an R value of 1.6, so it's about the same as the Therm-A-Rest accordion pad or a roll-up pad of sorts, except it does have some loft, which gives you a little more comfort. And again, it's pretty comfortable down into, say, the 50s in a hammock without an underquilt if you wanted to go with this option instead of the underquilt option. If you have an underquilt that's not rated really low, then you can use this in conjunction with an underquilt to increase that R value and give you a little more comfort and loft. And that's kind of what I choose to do a lot of the time into the winter if I'm sleeping in a hammock. So that's pretty much enough about hammocks for this video. Now let's talk back again. You can go online to Amazon and you can buy a fairly inexpensive blow-up style pad like a Sleepingo or something like that. And they're going to be in that 1.7, 1.9 R value. The problem with those type pads that I found in the past has been durability. I went through several of those and punctured holes in them. So they're not the most durable pad out there, but they are very inexpensive. So the pads I'm going to talk to you about today are going to be a little bit more higher end pads. And depending on how much loft and insulation value they have and what the R value is, they generally cost more as you work your way up. I'm not going to give you exact costs of these things because I don't have that written down necessarily, because you can find them on sale, you can find them at different sites, and they're going to be different prices depending on where you go. What I want to talk to you about today is I want to talk to you specifically about the pads and their R value. Okay, so the first pad we'll talk about is this Insulated Static V Camo. And this is my go-to pad. This is a pad that has a high R value. It's not overly expensive. It has a nice full rectangle footprint, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. And it has pretty good loft. It's not the thickest pad by a long shot, but it's not the thinnest pad either. And it does have, again, an R value of like 4.6, 4.8. So it gives you a 4-season pad in a package the size of a 32-ounce water bottle to, let's say, a full-size grail. So if you're looking at that grail, you're looking at a little bit bigger in diameter and about the same length as the grail for a pad like this. And it's a comfortable pad to sleep on beyond a shadow of a doubt. The Static V, this is the Static V Camo. It comes in other colors as well. You can check that out and it will be fine for you. We should kind of walk through these a little bit, I guess, by brand, so we don't get too confused. So let's start off with the Therm-A-Rest first, since we talked about this Z pad in the beginning. So as Therm-A-Rest pads go, you have the yellow pad, which is the Neo Air Light, and I don't have that pad out here, but I do have one, and it's a fairly decent pad. It comes in an R value of in the 3 range, so it's not a bad pad at all. A lot of the Appalachian trail hikers use that pad. One step up from that pad would be the Therm-A-Rest Neo Air X Light, and it's a gray color pad. And again, it's very lightweight, weighs well under a pound, doesn't have much bulk. You can see it's about the size of that water bottle, and it actually, for weight, I would say it doesn't weigh any more than an empty grail. So it's a very lightweight pad. The problem that I found with this pad, it does have some good R value. This Air X Light has an R value of 4.2, which means it's going to be good in those cooler temperatures. The only problem I've found with this pad that I'm not real comfortable with is it doesn't have a lot of loft. It's only about that thick when it's blown up. And it's also a tapered pad that tapers down toward the foot area. So you kind of have to sleep with your feet together or you're going to be off the pad. If you roll around much, you're going to be off of this pad. If you sleep pretty static on your back, this pad is a great pad for that. No question about it. A step up from that would be the Air X Therm, okay, or the X Therm Mat by Therm-A-Rest. And it's very much like the Neo Air, except it's an insulated pad. It has insulation in it besides just the air and loft, it has insulation added to the pad. And the R value of this pad is 6.9 according to their website. So this would be considered a 4-season pad. Now, the other issue with this pad, just like this pad, is not the fact that it's plenty warm. It doesn't have a lot of loft, similar to this one, and it's also a tapered footprint. So if you roll around, you're going to be off this mat. It is tapered toward the foot box. Other than that, I've never had a problem with either one of those Therm-A-Rest mats, and they're very durable. I haven't had any problems with them all. Now the yellow mat, the Neo Air Light, I think it's called, I did puncture one of those up in the mountains in Northern California, but I think that was my fault for setting it up on a bad piece of ground to begin with, but it did lose air overnight. I haven't taken the time to find the hole in it yet. It was fairly new at the time, so I'm not sure if it sprung a leak around the valve or if I actually punched a hole in it, because I haven't investigated that yet. Again, I'm not real comfortable with those narrow foot box pads because I do move around and you're going to end up off of that thing in the middle of the night. So that being said, I prefer a pad that's the same width all the way down. Now, the other pads that I'm pretty particular about, that I like really well, are the climate pads. And we'll talk about the climate pads next, because we already spoke about both the hammock V and the static V. And those are both good pads, but they both have R values of less than 2, although they do add some loft. And the static V has a nice wide footprint so that you can lay on it and be comfortable. It does have some loft, but it has a fairly low R value, like I said, and the packability of it is fair. It's not as light as the Therm-A-Rest, but again, you're getting more pad at the same time for that weight value that you're adding, okay? Now, the pads that I've been using quite often lately are called the Clima Loft pads. And the Clima Loft pads, I have 2 of them over here I'm going to show you. One is the regular and one is the XL. The regular has an R value of a little over 2, and I can't nail down what the R value is of the XL yet. I'm waiting on an email back from Climate on that, but it is 5 inches thick as far as loft, and both of these pads have foam on top of them for added insulative value, and it's probably one of the most comfortable pads, again, comfortable pads I've ever slept on. Not necessarily the warmest as far as R value, but the comfort level is phenomenal. So I'm going to show you those pads because I have both of them blown up because I've been testing them in this tent on and off the last couple of weeks. Okay, so these 2 pads are the Clima Loft, okay? And this one is the regular, and the one below it is the XL. You can see there's quite a bit of difference in the thickness of these pads. This one is about 3 inches. This one is like 5 inches almost, all right? They both have a foam on top of them that's underneath a fabric liner, or a fabric cover, I should say. And they're really heavy duty material on the bottom to keep them from getting punctured. In the foot area, or where you would have your bottom of your legs and your feet, there is no extra padding. But up here where your torso would be, you have a lot of extra padding and loft added with that foam. And this is a very, very comfortable pad to sleep on. Now, there's a couple things I'm really fond about this whole climate system. Number one is, again, is that pad on there. And number 2 is the loft that it gives you and the wide footprint so that you can lay on this thing and not roll off of it. The other thing I really like about this is the way that they inflate, deflate. And I'm going to adjust this camera here for you a little bit. You have a valve that you open on this, and when you open the valve, it doesn't deflate the mat because you actually have a pop valve here that you have to pop sideways to deflate the mat. And you have a deflate side and you have an inflate side. So when you have it on the inflate side and locked in, when you're inflating this mat, it doesn't leak any air back out if you stop. Now you can blow this mat up with your mouth with forced air, or you can use this climate air pump. And this climate air pump doesn't take up a lot of space in your pack, and it doesn't weigh very much. It's USB rechargeable, but it works fantastic. You get a USB cord in there, and you get a nozzle that you plug onto the front of it, and it's just a rubber stopper that sits over the top of this, just like this, so that when you turn it on, it forces air into the mat, just like you were blowing air into it yourself. And as long as I don't flip that inflate deflate valve, any air that I put inside there is going to stay. And when I want to deflate the mat, I just pop that the other direction, and the mat deflates on its own to where I can pack it up. And what we're going to do with this mat today is we're going to roll this one up real quick and show you the size of it packed, because these two mats are a little larger than the mats that we've been talking about so far. But I think in the case of these Clima Lofts, they're definitely worth their weight. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take this thing and I'm going to start rolling it up to force the air out of it, just like this. And the valve on the front of this is a one-way valve. So once we get up here toward the front end of this thing, what I'm going to do is I'm going to lock this valve to the deflate side where it says deflate here, and that's going to push air out one direction, but it's not going to let any air in. If I have that valve sideways, the way I deflated it like this, it's going to let air back in. If I lock it to the deflate side, then I can force the air out of it, and no air can be sucked back into it when I roll it out. So then I'm just going to cover that back up. And now I can take this, fold it in half, and roll it back down. Again, I like the fact that this doesn't take very long to get this thing rolled up and put away. That's the other thing I really like about this mat. Again, it does have some bulk to it, especially when you get up into this foam. But if you just keep it folded in half as you go. And this bulk that you're seeing here is the foam. It's not air trapped in there. We've already taken all the air out of it. So when we get that thing down, now we're down to this as far as the entire bulk of this mat. And we'll pack this up and compare this to that water bottle. Now the way this Clima Loft works is it has a strap, a cinch strap that you can put around it. It's Velcro. And once you get that done, you have a bag, basically a compression bag for this that you put it into. Just like this. And that compression bag has end caps on it here that you pull over the top. That are very much like a sleeping bag cinch sack, for lack of a better word. And so what you get when you're done with that is you get something that is about the size of, grab this water bottle here, you got that's probably the size of 2 grails. If you stack them up on top of each other, it'd probably be a little bit smaller than 2 grails stacked this way and 2 grails stacked that way. So a grail and a half probably, and about the same length as your grail. And it says on here that this thing weighs 2.4 pounds, which 1.1 kilograms is what it says on here. And the R value of 2.1, what it says on this one. Unfortunately, the XL does not have the R value on it. I'm waiting on Clima Loft to get back to me on that. However, like I said, the fact that this thing is 5 inches thick gives it more loft and probably gives it quite a bit higher R value. And I've already slept on this thing down around 42, 43 degrees, and it's been fine. Okay, the last two mats I want to discuss with you guys are X-Bed mats, and we've got the Downmet XP7 and the Synmat XP7. One's got synthetic insulation, one has down insulation. The difference is this one's a little bit heavier with the down. The bulk is about the same as far as the size of the packaging goes. They're a little bit more difficult to inflate and deflate, in my opinion, than Clima Loft or Climate in general. However, the insulative value or R value of these things is hard to match in a pad, especially this down, Synmat down, okay? The Synmat 7 down mat is an R value of 5.8. This is definitely a 4-season winter weather mat. I've had this one in Sweden many, many times down into the 40s and below, and it is plenty warm. The R value of that is 4.8. So you've got one number difference in R value and the difference of down or synthetic insulation added to the loft. There's not as much loft in either one of these mats as there is in the Synmat, or excuse me, in the Clima Loft XL. However, these are both very comfortable mats to sleep on. The downside, I guess, not to use a pun there, but the downside to either one of these mats is the cost. They are very, very expensive mats. However, I haven't had a problem with tearing them up. I haven't had a problem with sleeping on them. They're very comfortable mats, but they're expensive and they are fairly bulky, especially if you're using a mat or looking for a mat that you're only going to use in 2 or 3 seasons. You really don't need either one of those mats. I would look at the other brands. But like I said, we looked at 3 brands today. We looked at Therm-A-Rest, we looked at Clima Loft, and we looked at X-Bed. All 3 of them are top manufacturers of sleeping pads. It's just a matter of how much do you want to spend, how much bulk do you want to pack, how much weight do you want to pack, and how much R value or insulated value do you want to have when you're sleeping, and how comfortable do you want to be while you're doing it. And to me, comfort level is important. Yes, comfort comes from warmth, but comfort also comes from loft and footprint. And to me, a square or rectangle mat, a rectangle mat that is the same width from the shoulders to the foot box is much more comfortable for me to sleep on and not have to worry about getting my feet off the mat in the middle of the night than a tapered mat, and that's what really takes me away from the Therm-A-Rest and leads me more toward the Climate, is that it's a non-tapered mat and it works really, really well. I appreciate your views. I appreciate your support. I thank you for everything you do for our school, for our family, and for our business, for all of our sponsors, instructors, affiliates, and friends. And I'll be back with another video as soon as I can. Thanks, guys.